Hello and welcome. This is Echoes of the Forgotten Earth, a place where your thoughts can slow down without being judged for drifting, where science doesn't rush you and curiosity doesn't have to prove anything to be allowed to exist. Tonight, I want to begin with something simple enough to fit in a single breath, and heavy enough to feel like it's been buried under your feet for a very long time. What if we're not the first ones to listen? Not the first to look at stone and see a story. Not the first to look at fire and feel both comfort and fear. Not the first to build, not the first to name the stars. Not the first to make a world and then watch it slip away. What if we are what a forgotten civilization left behind? Not their statues, not their towers, not even their bones, but the quieter inheritance and arrangement. A readiness, a set of conditions in the atmosphere and the oceans, a pattern in life's long habit of trying again. It sounds like myth when you say it out loud. It sounds like the kind of idea that belongs to whispered radio at 2 a.m. when the window glass turns the city into a reflection and everything familiar suddenly looks ancient. But Earth is old enough to make myth feel practical. Earth forgets the way an ocean forgets footprints, patiently, completely, without malice. And it's worth asking gently what kinds of things a planet can erase and what kinds of things it can't. Before we go any deeper, I want to know where you're listening from. You don't have to tell me, not really. Just notice it for yourself. The room you're in, the light you're under, the sound behind the sound. Maybe you're surrounded by the electric hush of a city air conditioners, traffic, distant voices that blur into one steady river of noise. Maybe you're somewhere quiet enough that you can hear your own building settle, the small clicks and pops of material cooling down as night takes hold. And what time is it for you right now? In your own tiny pocket of the present. There's something strange about that, isn't there? How two people can be hearing the same words while the world around them is in different hours, different weather, different lives. Like we're lined up along a timeline, scattered across it, but touching the same thought at the same moment. Tonight's thought is slow. It doesn't want to be solved. It only wants to be carried. So let's carry it carefully. Because if humanity is a sequel, then the prologue is missing. And Earth is the kind of author that tears pages out, burns others, and rewrites the rest until the original story becomes almost impossible to recognize. We tend to imagine the past as a thing that sits still, waiting. We picture ruins in deserts, temples in jungles, towers swallowed by vines, cities in the sea. We picture the past as a place you can find, like a house with an address. But the deep past is not a place, it's a process. Over enough time, continents travel like slow animals. Oceans rise and fall. Ice arrives like a quiet machine and grinds mountains into powder. Rivers cut new sentences into stone. Volcanic fields lay down fresh paragraphs of basalt, hot ink on an older page. The surface of the planet is not a museum. It's a workshop. And when you realize that, you start to understand why the question is even possible. If an earlier civilization, something industrial, something clever, something hungry, had existed 10 million years ago, the odds are that you wouldn't find its streets. You wouldn't find its skyline. You might not even find its trash. You would find chemistry. A thin line, maybe, in deep sediments, a flicker in carbon ratios, a subtle bruise in isotopes, a strange layer where the planet's usual handwriting wobbles for a moment, as if something with intention pressed too hard on the pen. We think we know what the oldest human structures are. 12,000 years feels ancient because our minds are built around lifetimes and names and the memory of grandparents. 12,000 years feels like it should have turned to dust. But to the planet, it's the blink you miss. Earth is 4.5 billion years old. On that scale, Our entire recorded history is less than a heartbeat. Not even a heartbeat more, like the tremble in your wrist before you decide to move. And that's where the thought gets its teeth. Because if time is good at anything, it's at erasing evidence that a thing ever felt permanent. We build as if our materials are immortal. Steel, concrete, glass. We say words like infrastructure, as if the ground beneath them won't someday fold, melt, or get carried away like silt in a flood. But the planet is a patient recycler. Ocean crust is born at ridges and dies at trenches. It carries the surface down into the mantle like a conveyor belt that doesn't care what you've placed on top of it. The oldest ocean floor we can study is only a couple 100 million years old. Everything older has been swallowed. So if a civilization rose on a coastline that later became ocean floor, if its cities were built where a tectonic plate eventually decided to dive, then the entire record could be gone. Not hidden. Gone. It's difficult for a human mind to accept that, because we're raised on the idea of archives, libraries, hard drives, photographs, fossils, museums. We're trained to believe that time is a storage unit. But for a planet with tectonics, time is a shredder. And still, sometimes the shredder jams. Sometimes there are oddities. A metal sphere found embedded where it shouldn't be. Microscopic structures that look too precise, found in sediments too old. Patterns that could be natural, and usually are, because nature can do things that imitate design better than design can imitate nature. Scientists are right to be skeptical. Skepticism is the price of honesty. A planet makes weird shapes. Pressure makes symmetry. Chemistry makes order. If you look long enough, stone will sometimes resemble a tool, and a tool will sometimes resemble stone. But the fascination remains, not because the anomalies prove anything, but because they remind us how thin our certainty really is. If a civilization once altered the atmosphere, it might have left no monument, but it might have left an atmospheric fingerprint that shows up as a brief disturbance in a long sediment record. And that's when the question turns around and looks at us. Because whatever we are imagining about them, we are currently doing ourselves. We are changing the air. We are changing oceans. We are leaving behind synthetic molecules that nature doesn't make easily on its own. We are scattering a layer of new materials across the planet: plastics, alloys, isotopes like a signature written into the crust. And someday, far from now, if another intelligence arises, if another mind looks down at the layers the way we look down now, our greatest evidence might not be a statue. It might be a thin, dirty line, a chemical scar. That's a strange kind of immortality, isn't it? To be remembered not by stories or names, but by an anomaly in stone. Not who were they, but what did they do to the air? There's something humbling there, something that presses gently on the ego. We like to think we're the center of the narrative, the first to measure, the first to map, the first to know. But the Earth has hosted ages of dominance before. Forests taller than houses, insects as wide as birds, reptiles ruling for spans of time that make empires look like sparks. They vanished, not as a dramatic ending with a curtain, but as a geological shift, a change in chemistry, a new rule written into the climate. And if a world can lose a dynasty of living forms that lasted hundreds of millions of years, why couldn't it lose a civilization? We treat intelligence like it's a staircase with us at the top. But evolution doesn't climb, it wanders. Octopuses solve puzzles and escape enclosures like they're thinking sideways. Dolphins recognize themselves and each other and keep relationships that outlast seasons. Birds plan, cache, trick, remember. Nature tries on complexity the way a person tries on coats. Some fit for a while, some are discarded, some return in a new style later. So somewhere back there, in the deep time where the calendar stops being useful, could there have been a branch that went farther? Far enough to build, far enough to burn fuel, to change air, to write a brief, bright line into stone. Far enough to vanish so completely that even the rocks forgot the name, If so, we may never find their cities. We may never know their faces. We may only know that for a moment the planet's chemistry was disturbed by intent. And perhaps that is the only kind of evidence any civilization ever truly leaves. Not because we don't matter, but because time has its own language and it doesn't speak in monuments. It speaks in minerals. It speaks in molecules. It speaks in layers pressed flat under pressure, where whole worlds become a thin seam of color. Sometimes I think of Earth as an archivist who refuses to be sentimental. It keeps what can be flattened and buried. Everything else, our pride, our towers, our names, gets handed back to wind and water. If you wanted to hide an entire civilization, you wouldn't need to do anything dramatic. You just let the planet do what it has always done. Let the crust drift. Let the ice grind. Let the sea rise and fall. Let rivers rewrite coastlines. Let the mantle recycle the floor of the world. And then, after enough time, the only trace would be the faintest fingerprint, a whisper in isotope ratios that someone might one day find and wonder about. Not who were they, but why does this layer look wrong? It makes you see our own era differently. Our cities feel permanent because they are large and because our lives are short. But permanence is an illusion created by scale. On the planet's scale, our whole industrial age might become a bright, narrow band and unusual seam that marks a brief fever in the climate record. A future geologist might label it the way we label extinctions, not with our names, with our effect. And in that sense, the old question becomes a mirror. What if we are what the first civilization left behind? Not a library, not a monument, but a planet made ready. A chemistry tuned by accident or by slow influence to allow minds to arise again. A biosphere nudged maybe toward complexity. A world that has learned through trial and collapse how to produce creatures that wonder. Maybe that's what survives. Not the artifact, but the tendency. A planet shaped, refined, made fertile for thought. And maybe that's what we are. Not the first flame, but the ember that caught again after a long silence. Then again, maybe it isn't only the past that's difficult to see. Maybe it's us. We're used to thinking of history as a straight line. First this, then that, a slow climb from stone to metal to glass to light. It makes the mind feel safe. A line suggests direction, progress, control. A sense that the future is something we're moving toward on purpose. But the planet doesn't move in lines. It moves in cycles and spirals and loops so wide they barely look like repetition until you step back far enough to see the pattern. And that's where the idea of earlier civilizations stops sounding like pure fiction and starts sounding like an uncomfortable statistical question. Because Earth is not a quiet stage that has been waiting empty for humans to arrive. It has been busy colliding continents into mountains, then grinding them back into sand. Busy flooding coastal plains, then lifting seabeds into plateaus. Busy freezing into white stillness, and then melting into green again. Busy, above all, experimenting with life, rewriting the living world again and again, with each shift in temperature, chemistry, and light. A world that active doesn't preserve many footprints. It preserves pressure. It preserves accidents. It preserves whatever happens to fall into the right place at the right time and get sealed away from oxygen like a secret. Even fossils. Those iconic symbols of the past are not common. They feel common because we build museums and fill books with them. But the planet itself is not littered with fossils like confetti. Fossilization is rare. It requires a chain of luck so specific that most living things vanish without leaving even an outline. A leaf dissolves. A bone is scattered. A shell is crushed and reabsorbed. So what chance would a civilization have? We imagine that a civilization would leave obvious remains because we're surrounded by our own. But our remains are obvious only because we're here to see them while they're still young. Give our world 1,000,000 years. Steel will rust into red dust and then into more subtle minerals. Concrete will crack, leach, soften, and crumble into a kind of stone that doesn't resemble anything intentional. Glass will weather. Plastics will fragment and fragment again until they become a kind of synthetic pollen, tiny, pervasive, almost invisible. Cities will become topography. Roads will become faint, linear differences in soil composition. Mines will collapse, fill with water, and become caverns no one calls human-made. And then give it 10 million years. The outlines will blur further. Erosion will eat what remains above ground. Sediments will bury what's left below. Heat and pressure will press everything into new rock, folding our age into a layer, the way a wave folds foam back into the sea. And then give it 100 million years. The continents will no longer look familiar. The oceans will have shifted. The places we think of as stable coastlines, mountain ranges will have changed like faces change across a lifetime. At that scale, even if our civilization were the loudest thing Earth ever hosted, its physical loudness would fade into a quiet chemical whisper. That's not pessimism. That's geology. The planet's surface is a palimpsest, a manuscript written, scraped away, and written over again. The ink becomes faint. The older lines become harder to read. But the page keeps being used, which means there are two kinds of past. There's the recent past, the one we can dig up with shovels and brushes and careful hands, the past that still has shapes and edges. And then there's the deep past, the one we can only sense through chemistry, through ratios, through anomalies in layers we never see directly. That's where the conversation becomes strange. Because if an earlier industrial civilization existed far back enough, we shouldn't expect to find its buildings. We should expect to find its side effects. Not a tower, but a scar. Not a tool, but a signature. A brief imbalance in the carbon cycle. A sudden appearance of compounds that don't form easily without guidance. A strange concentration of metals and sediments that would otherwise be quiet. And yes, those kinds of signatures can happen naturally. Volcanoes can flood the atmosphere with carbon dioxide. Methane can erupt from the seafloor. A warming event can spike, then settle. Nature can mimic the symptoms of industry. That's part of what makes the question so slippery. The planet has moods. It has fevers. It has eras when it breathes differently. So the honest approach isn't to declare that we've found evidence of ancient factories. The honest approach is to admit that, in principle, a civilization could be reduced to something that looks like weather. A disturbance, then silence, a thin dark line, then an age of forgetting. And in that possibility, there's something that changes how you feel about the ground beneath you. Because the ground beneath you is not one world. It is thousands of worlds stacked. If you could peel the crust back like pages, you'd see ancient oceans turned to limestone, forests compressed into coal, deserts baked into sandstone, layers of ash marking days when the sky went dark, seams of soot recording great fires, thin bands rich in iridium, the signature of an impact that ended an era. Every layer is a memory. But it's a memory written in a language that doesn't care about our sense of drama. It doesn't say, "This was the moment everything changed." It says, "Here's a slight shift in composition." And then it moves on. Sometimes when geologists drill deep cores from the earth, they pull up a column of time colors, textures, grains, each one representing a different world. It's a quiet kind of magic, holding a cylinder and knowing that you're touching ages you can't truly picture. But even those columns have gaps. There are sections where erosion removed what had been laid down. There are missing chapters, unconformities, places where time is absent, where millions of years simply didn't make it into the archive. It's eerie when you think about it. We assume the past is buried, but some of it isn't buried at all. Some of it is gone, not hidden in a secret chamber, not waiting for discovery, gone, dissolved, recycled, turned into something else. And once you accept that, the idea of a lost civilization becomes less about finding a lost city and more about acknowledging that the planet is not obligated to preserve evidence for our curiosity. If something happened long enough ago, Earth may have overwritten it so completely that even our best instruments would struggle to separate it from the planet's own natural chaos. We like to imagine we live on ancient stable ground, but the ground is moving even now. The continents drift a few centimeters each year. It's slow enough to feel like stillness, but over time, it's unstoppable. In 10 million years, coastlines shift. In 100 million years, oceans open or close, and mountain ranges rise where there used to be shallow sea. If you could speed up time, you'd watch continents dance, collide, split, and circle like slow puzzle pieces on a table that never stops shaking. This is why Earth forgets so well. Ocean crust forms, spreads, and is consumed in subduction zones. Whatever rests on it is carried down and melted. The ocean floor has a maximum lifespan, and it is short compared to the age of the planet. The oldest ocean crust we can study is young. 200 million years is enough time for evolution to build and destroy entire worlds of life. 200 million years is also enough time for a civilization to exist, vanish, and leave almost nothing recognizable behind. And the planet has had many sets of 200 million years. So when people ask, why haven't we found anything? The answer may be simple. Because Earth is not designed to keep secrets. It is designed to keep changing. A truly ancient civilization wouldn't be hidden the way a coin is hidden in a wall. It would be erased the way a shoreline is erased. Patiently, thoroughly, without intention. This is where a kind of humility begins to creep in, if you let it. Because we like to believe that our achievements mean we are permanent. But permanence has never been part of the contract. Even rock is temporary. Even mountains are temporary. Even continents are temporary. And if those things can be ground down and rewritten, then our towers and machines are not even a question. They're a suggestion. A brief arrangement of matter held together by maintenance and belief. There's a strange comfort in that too, if you're willing to feel it. It means the world is not brittle. It means the Earth has survived far worse than the chaos of one species. It has survived impacts that turned day into night for years. It has survived volcanic winters so severe they rewrote the chemistry of oceans. It has survived ice ages that buried continents. It has survived its own internal convulsions. And after each catastrophe, life returned. Not always the same life, not the same dominant forms, but life nonetheless, finding new solutions, new shapes, new ways of breathing. So if a civilization existed and fell, the Earth would not mourn. It would recycle. It would take the metals, the carbon, the minerals, and distribute them back into the system. And eventually, those materials would become part of something else. Perhaps part of us. That's where the thought becomes more intimate, almost too intimate. Because the atoms that make your body are old. The calcium in your bones was once part of a shell in a sea that no longer exists. The iron in your blood was forged in stars that died before Earth was born. The carbon in your cells cycled through forests and microbes in oceans. Matter doesn't just persist, it travels. Which means that if another civilization existed long ago, even if it left no artifacts, it still left matter. Its bodies became soil. Its tools became minerals. Its fires became atmosphere. In that way, the past is not behind you. It is inside you. And perhaps that is the most honest definition of inheritance we have. Not stories, not ruins, but chemistry. The world you live in now is an arrangement created by countless past arrangements. The oxygen you breathe is not ancient in the way rock is ancient. It is biologically ancient, produced by life and maintained by life. The atmosphere is not just air. It's a living artifact. It's a product of countless organisms that changed the planet by existing on it. Long before humans, life was already engineering Earth. Microbes oxygenated the air and transformed the surface, changing what was possible for every species that followed. Forests shifted the carbon cycle. Plankton altered oceans. Life has been rewriting the planet's conditions for billions of years. So the question, What if there were civilizations before us sits inside a larger truth? Earth has always been shaped by its inhabitants. We are not the first to leave a mark. We are simply leaving one that happens faster and louder and more self-aware than most. That self-awareness is the new variable. We can see what we're doing. We can measure it. We can predict consequences. And because we can see it, we can't pretend it's invisible. Sometimes I wonder if that's the only real difference between us and whatever might have come before. Not intelligence itself, but the ability to look at a planet and recognize the pattern of forgetting, to recognize that the Earth will outlast every city, every archive, every empire, to recognize that if we want to be remembered, we may need to think in a language time respects. Not stone, not steel, but something that can survive the long churn. And then I remember something else, just as quiet and strange. Maybe being remembered isn't the point. Maybe the point is to become part of the next beginning, because the planet doesn't preserve individuals. It preserves conditions. It preserves the possibility of life. And perhaps that is the only kind of continuity that truly matters. If a previous civilization existed, perhaps its greatest legacy wasn't a monument, but a small change that made the next rise of intelligence slightly more likely. A subtle shift in ecology, a genetic echo, a chemical nudge. Not a library, but a readiness. When you think about it like that, the silence of deep time feels different. It doesn't feel empty. It feels like a room that has been used before, cleaned, rearranged, and prepared again. And we are living in it now, placing our own furniture, making our own noise, convinced most days that we are the first ones to ever call this place home. But the Earth is old enough to have hosted many homes, and it is quiet enough to hide their names. There's a point, somewhere between geology and imagination, where the ground stops giving you clean answers and starts offering you something else instead. A feeling, not certainty. Never that. Earth doesn't hand out certainty the way we want it to. Earth hands out clues the way a dream hands out images. Partial, symbolic, easy to misread. And when the physical record grows thin, when rock has been recycled, when sediment has been scraped away, when the pages have been torn out, another kind of record starts to matter. The one carried in minds. The one we call myth. We treat myth like a child treats shadow puppets. Entertaining, unreal, something that disappears when the light changes. But myths are older than writing, older than cities, older than the idea of history as a thing you can organize into timelines and dates. Myths are how a species stores memory when it has no paper. They are what remains when everything else is too fragile to last. And if you listen closely, the myths of the world sound like they've been humming the same melody for a very long time. Floods that wash away an age, fires that fall from the sky, golden kingdoms that vanish beneath the sea, teachers who arrive from somewhere beyond the horizon and leave behind knowledge like seed. You can find these themes in places that never shared a language. It would be easy to dismiss that as coincidence, a universal human tendency to fear water and worship the sun. And some of it is exactly that. Humans are pattern-making creatures, and we build stories out of weather and hunger because it helps us survive. But the persistence is still strange, not the details. The details always change. Names shift, gods become heroes, heroes become warnings. It's the structure that stays the same. A world begins, a world flourishes, a world breaks. A few survive. A new world starts over. The myth doesn't promise permanence. It promises continuity. And maybe that's why it keeps showing up, century after century, mouth to mouth, like a torch passed in a blackout. When you read ancient stories with modern eyes, it's tempting to look for hidden facts like they're coded history waiting to be decrypted. That can be a trap. Myths aren't newspapers. They aren't written to be accurate in the way science demands. They're written to endure, which means they compress. 100 years becomes a moment. A regional disaster becomes global. A shifting coastline becomes a lost continent. Truth becomes shape, and the shape is what survives. So when a culture tells a story about the sea swallowing a land, you can read it as metaphor and still respect it as memory. After the last ice age, sea levels rose, coastlines moved, entire habitable shelves flooded. People who lived there didn't call it post-glacial melt. They called it loss. They called it punishment. They called it the gods. And if your world is coastal, if your survival is tied to tides, then a rising sea doesn't feel like a slow graph. It feels like the end of an age. In that sense, myths of floods make perfect natural sense. But what about the other themes? What about the figures who arrive with knowledge that seems to appear fully formed? The stories of a teacher who brings agriculture, writing, calendars, law. Sometimes those are clearly cultural inventions, a way to give sacred origin to ordinary human innovation. Sometimes they are political, legitimizing power by claiming it came from above. But sometimes, reading them, you feel a quiet dissonance. The sensation that the story is trying to carry something heavier than it can hold. Not proof, just weight. And then you look at the archaeological record and you see bursts places where a civilization seems to leap. A sudden sophistication in engineering, astronomy that arrives surprisingly mature, standardized weights, complex planning, systems that suggest years of invisible experimentation. We can explain it, of course. Human brains are good at converging on solutions. We learn, we trade, we copy, we build on older failures. But the speed still startles. And that's where myth becomes interesting again, not as evidence, but as context. Because maybe the leap isn't a leap. Maybe it's a remembering. Not in the conscious sense, not like a person recalling a forgotten name. Something deeper, something instinctual. A tendency in a species to rebuild certain shapes when conditions allow. Have you ever noticed how people who have never met, who grew up with different music, will still hum melodies that sound strangely similar? Not because they've heard the same song, but because the brain has patterns it likes. Certain intervals feel natural. Certain rhythms feel inevitable. Civilizations may do something similar. Given enough stability and food, a mind reaches for counting, for measurement, for calendars, for architecture, for symbols that outlast breath. Maybe this isn't mysterious. Maybe it's just the geometry of intelligence. But if it is, then it opens a door to a darker kind of possibility. Because if intelligence converges, then civilization converges, which means the rise of civilization might not be rare. And if the rise is common, the fall might be too. We like to imagine that our era is the first time matter has organized itself into global networks, into machines that think, into cities that glow at night like constellations on the surface. But the planet is old enough to have hosted many attempts. We are only the first attempt that has kept records long enough to call itself the first. And that brings us back to the problem of evidence. Because myths can't prove anything. They can only whisper. And the physical anomalies, the objects that shouldn't exist, they almost always collapse under scrutiny. Misdated layers, contamination. Natural formations mistaken for tools. Skepticism is right. It keeps us honest. But the anomalies still matter, in a way that isn't about being true. They matter because they show you the edge of the map. They show you how hungry the mind is for continuity. An out-of-place artifact is a story-shaped hole. It makes people lean in. It invites the imagination to fill the gap. A hammer in stone. A gear in coal. A sphere inside a rock. Most of these stories are either mistaken or inflated and sometimes outright fabricated. A world full of longing will always create false relics. We want there to be something. We want to feel that our presence is not solitary. But even false artifacts can reveal something real about us. The shape of our longing. We want ancestors beyond our ancestors. Not because we're obsessed with the past, but because we're afraid of being alone in time. We scan the sky for signals from other star systems, imagining civilizations light years away, while ignoring the possibility that the closest alien civilization might be our own planet's forgotten chapter. Sometimes I think that's a psychological defense. If intelligence is out there, far away, then it doesn't threaten our uniqueness here. It remains safely distant, a romance of the cosmos. But if intelligence was here, before, if someone else built, wondered, and fell, then we have to confront a more intimate truth. Progress is not guaranteed. The future is not a straight line. Civilization is not immune to the planet's rhythm, and that is a difficult thing for a modern mind to hold. We build narratives around advancement. We build identities around being unprecedented. The idea that we might be repeating a cycle feels like an insult to our pride. But geology doesn't care about pride. Geology cares about time, and time is not sentimental. It takes empires the way it takes coastlines. The Earth has no obligation to preserve our books. It has no obligation to remember our names. It has no obligation to keep our towers standing. It will, in the end, remember us the way it remembers everything. As a layer, as a chemical shift, as a brief rearrangement of matter that changed the context for whatever came next. In a way, that's the most sobering thought of all. Not that we will be forgotten, but that we might be misunderstood. Imagine a mind in the far future, digging into sediment, finding a thin band rich in plastics and strange isotopes, and trying to interpret it. They might argue about it the way we argue about warming events in deep time. Was this a volcanic era? Was it a methane release? Was it an impact? Or was it intention? And then imagine them never being able to answer. Because the monuments are gone. The stories are gone. All that remains is the scar. It's strange to realize that for all our obsession with leaving a legacy, our truest legacy may be something no one can fully translate. A whisper in stone. A disturbance that looks, from far enough away, like weather. And maybe that's what happened before. Maybe there was another disturbance long ago, faint enough to be explained away. Maybe the planet has seen this kind of imbalance more than once, not necessarily caused by minds, but caused by life reaching a threshold and pushing the system too hard. And maybe that threshold is part of a repeating pattern. Life grows complex. Complexity grows hungry. Hunger grows into alteration. Alteration triggers collapse. Collapse resets the board. And then, quietly, patiently, life starts again. The thought isn't meant to convince you. It's meant to soften something, to loosen the tight grip we keep on the idea that we are exceptional. Because if we can let go of that, even a little, we may see ourselves more clearly. Not as the final act, not as the crown, but as one more iteration in a long experiment the planet has been running for billions of years. Matter learning to look at itself. And that changes the feeling of myth. If myth is a fossil, then it's a fossil of meaning, not of bone. It doesn't preserve details. It preserves the outline of what mattered enough to carry forward. Flood, fire, teacher, loss, renewal. And maybe those aren't merely stories about what happened. Maybe they are stories about what always happens. Not in a fatalistic way, more like seasons. Not, you must fall, but be aware that winter exists. The oldest myths, in that sense, aren't just entertainment. They're survival memory. They're how a species warns itself across generations when it has no other reliable medium. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder whether those myths might be doing something even older than that. I wonder whether the pattern is not just human, whether the rhythm rise, flourish, collapse, renewal is what any civilization eventually learns, whether the myths are less like human inventions and more like echoes that consciousness produces whenever it becomes aware of time. The flood, the fire, the fall, those might be universal metaphors. They might be what intelligence sounds like when it tries to talk about impermanence, which would mean that if civilizations existed before us, they may not have left behind artifacts we can hold. but they may have left behind the same melody we keep hearing in our oldest stories. Not a blueprint, not a map, but a warning shape. A reminder that the Earth forgets, and that the forgetting is part of the design. And if that's true, then the question, were there others, becomes less important than another question, quieter and more difficult. If there were others, what did they learn too late? And are we listening? If you want to understand why the Earth hides its own history so well, you don't have to imagine conspiracies or secret vaults under mountains. You don't have to picture ancient machines buried intact, waiting. You only have to picture water. Because water is the planet's most elegant eraser, and also its most faithful witness. It's both. And that contradiction is part of why the past feels so slippery. On land, we can pretend we live on something solid. We can mark borders, build foundations, draw maps, and trust that the shapes will hold. The ground feels like a promise. It feels like permanence. But the planet was never built for permanence. It was built for motion. Rivers don't preserve. They take. They grind stone into smaller stone, and then into sand, and then into silt so fine it becomes suspension, a kind of memory clouded into water. They carry whole mountains away grain by grain, and they do it without hurry. They do it the way time does everything, patiently, almost tenderly, as if the act of erasing is also the act of reshaping. A coastline is not a line. It's an argument between land and sea. The sea wins eventually. It always does. It wins not with one dramatic wave, but with repetition. Salt, pressure, storms, rising and falling tides that never stop insisting. And then there's the deeper ocean, the part we rarely imagine properly. We tend to think of the ocean floor as a cemetery sunken ships, lost cities, a place where the past goes to sleep. But the ocean floor is not a museum. It's a conveyor belt. New crust rises at mid-ocean ridges, hot and fresh. It cools and spreads outward. It carries sediments, shells, the slow snowfall of organic debris. And then, millions of years later, it arrives at a trench and is dragged down into the mantle, melted, recycled. Everything resting on it goes with it. That's why the ocean is such a perfect place for the planet to forget. If something ancient were to vanish without leaving a trace, you'd want it to vanish where crust is temporary. You'd want it to vanish into a place that gets eaten. And the ocean does that for free. 200 million years is about the maximum age of ocean floor we can still read. Everything older has been consumed, which means the planet's oldest and most continuous surface, its ocean floor, has been routinely erased and renewed for most of Earth's history. The implication is simple and unsettling. If a civilization existed long before humans, the most likely place it would have lived? Coasts, deltas, river mouths, fertile shelves now underwater, are also the most likely places to have been erased. People are drawn to water. Life is drawn to water. Civilizations, as we know them, cluster along rivers and seas. It's not just convenience, it's biology remembering its origin. So if we imagine ancient cities, we imagine them where people would want to live. And those are exactly the places the ocean takes first. That's one reason the past feels quiet. Not because nothing happened, but because what happened in places the Earth is best at rewriting. And yet, for all its erasing, water also remembers. Not in the way stone remembers pressed and layered. Water doesn't hold shape. It refuses. It moves. It slips between states. But in that movement, it carries chemistry. It carries traces. It carries the faint, invisible signatures of everything it touches. If rock is the planet's hard archive, water is the planet's circulating archive. It doesn't store pages. It carries ink. Every drop you've ever touched has been touched before. The water in your body has been through ancient seas. It has been inside plants that were never named. It has run through the guts of creatures that vanished before mammals existed. It has fallen as rain on landscapes that don't exist anymore. That's not poetry. That's literal. Water cycles. It evaporates, condenses, falls, seeps, freezes, melts, runs, and returns. Over and over, endlessly. The molecules last. The forms change. The route is ancient and familiar. And because water moves through everything, it becomes a witness to everything. It's the planet's bloodstream. If you wanted to hide a civilization, you'd want to hide it from water. You'd want to keep its traces from dissolving into the planetary circulation. But that's nearly impossible. Even the things we think are stable are slowly leaching into groundwater, into rivers, into the sea. Even now, as you listen, the world is dissolving. Quietly, constantly, into water. Our metals oxidize and wash away as ions. Our plastics fragment into microscopic pieces and travel like dust. Our emissions become acid in rain and carbon in oceans. Our civilization is already entering the planet's fluid memory, which means that if someone ever tries to read us far in the future, they won't be reading our buildings. They'll be reading what our era did to cycles, to carbon, to nitrogen, to temperature and salinity, to the chemistry of shells, to the ratios of isotopes locked into sediments. That's the language water speaks to the future. Not story, but signal. And because water is both witness and eraser, the signal doesn't remain sharp forever. It diffuses. It spreads. It becomes harder to interpret. A civilization's impact might look, in the long view, like a strange blip, a warming event, a carbon excursion, a brief chemical tantrum, then silence. Then the planet's steady attempt to return to balance. In Earth's history, there have been warming events that still puzzle researchers. Spikes in carbon, ocean acidification, shifts in isotopic ratios. Most have plausible natural triggers: volcanism, methane release, orbital changes. But when you learn what our own industrial age looks like in those same terms, you realize something unsettling. Our footprint could be mistaken for a natural event too. Not because it is natural in the moral sense, but because the planet only records what it can record. It doesn't record intent. It records consequence. A future mind might see our age as a warming event, a sudden change in carbon signatures, a surge in unfamiliar molecules. They might argue about the cause. And if all they have is the record, they might never be able to prove that minds did it. That possibility should change how we think about earlier ages. Because if we are capable of leaving a signature that could later be misread as geology, then someone else might have done the same. If they existed, if they altered the cycles, if their era lasted long enough to disturb the planet in measurable ways, it would not look like a ruined skyline. It would look like a brief illness the Earth recovered from, a fever line, then calm, a pulse in sediment, then an age of forgetting. And maybe that's the most honest way to think about it. Not in terms of lost cities, but in terms of physiology. A planet is a system. Systems have rhythms. When a system is disturbed, it reacts. It compensates. It swings like a pendulum until it finds a new equilibrium. We are a disturbance right now. So were volcanoes in other ages. So were impacts. So were biological revolutions, oxygenation, the rise of forests, the spread of flowering plants. Life itself has repeatedly changed the planet so dramatically that it forced Earth into new states. In that context, an industrial civilization is not impossible. It's simply another kind of disturbance. The question is whether it happened and whether the evidence would survive in a way we could recognize. And recognition is the key. Because even if the signal were there, we might not know how to interpret it. We're looking for ourselves. We're looking for something familiar. Tools, geometry, artifacts. But the planet's archive is not organized around familiarity. It is organized around what lasts. And what lasts is often not the thing you'd expect. A plastic bottle won't survive as a bottle for long in geological time, but fragments of plastic might survive as a chemical presence in sediments. A skyscraper won't survive, but the mining and refining that built it might leave trace concentrations of elements redistributed unnaturally. A library won't survive, but radioactive isotopes from energy production might persist as a timestamp. So if you imagine an earlier civilization, you have to imagine that they are not preserved as an image. They are preserved as a pattern, a slight wrongness in the usual ratios, a fingerprint in the chemistry of oceans, a thin layer that makes a future geologist pause. And then you have to accept the next part too. Even those fingerprints fade. Not because the planet is malicious, because the planet is thorough. Water carries and dilutes, sediments bury, heat transforms, pressure reorganizes. Time diffuses every signal until it becomes part of the background hum of the world. This is what entropy looks like on a planetary scale. Not destruction, but redistribution. A story that doesn't end, but becomes unreadable. And yet, water keeps circulating, which means, in a strange way, the Earth never entirely lets go. It just changes the format of its memory. In ice, water becomes a time capsule. Tiny bubbles of ancient air trapped in glaciers tell us what the atmosphere once contained. We can read the breath of centuries, then millennia, then hundreds of thousands of years. In ocean sediments, water becomes a slow recorder. Layer upon layer of shells and dust fall and settle, and those layers capture temperature and chemistry across millions of years. In deep aquifers, water becomes fossil water rain trapped underground since climates that no longer exist. A sealed reservoir of ancient weather. Even in salt crystals sometimes, water traps tiny pockets of ancient atmosphere. A frozen whisper inside mineral. These are rare, fragile, but they exist. And they remind you that the planet does not forget evenly. It forgets loudly on the surface, where wind and tide erase everything. But it remembers in the deep, where burial slows time. So if there were earlier ages of intelligence, perhaps their traces, if any remain, are not where we look, not in exposed ruins, not on the surface, but in deep sediments, in cores drilled from ancient seabeds, in the subtle composition of layers that have been sealed from the world's constant weather. The idea isn't that we've found such evidence. The idea is that the only evidence that could survive would look nothing like the thing it came from. That's a hard thought for the mind because we want to find a face. We want a name. We want a story with recognizable characters. But the Earth doesn't preserve faces. It preserves consequences. And maybe that's the most honest lesson it offers any civilization that tries to outlast itself. You will not be remembered for your monuments. You will be remembered for what you changed. The air, the water, the cycles that make life possible. Your story will not be told in your language. It will be told in minerals, in molecules, in the quiet work of tides. Which means, if we are what the first civilization left behind, we may not be their descendants in any romantic sense. We may be their aftermath, the world they altered, now stabilized, the biosphere that recovered, the conditions that became just right again for minds to arise and ask the same question. And if that's true, then perhaps the most important thing is not to find them. Perhaps the most important thing is to understand what it means to become someone else's layer. Because we are already becoming it, even now. There's a particular kind of humility that comes from realizing you are already becoming geology. Not someday. Not in a distant, abstract future. Now. It happens quietly, in ways that don't feel dramatic enough to matter until you remember what time does with quiet things. A city doesn't have to collapse to begin turning into a layer. It only has to exist. Every day, a little bit of it flakes away. Microscopic dust from tires, fine particles from concrete, metal ions from corrosion. A mist of compounds you can't see, settling into soil, washing into rivers, drifting out to sea. A civilization is not only what it builds, it's what it sheds. And what it sheds becomes part of the planet's long record. Future rock won't remember the names of our streets. It will remember the presence of our molecules. Geologists have a word they sometimes use for the proposed slice of time we're living in now, an era defined by human influence on the planet. The Anthropocene. It's a name that sounds clinical, but when you sit with it, it feels like a confession. It means we have become a force comparable to the ones that shape epochs. Not because we are divine, but because we are numerous and energetic and restless. Because we burn ancient carbon and move mountains of earth and rearrange rivers and rewrite habitats and alter the chemistry of the seas. The planet is recording that. Not in a diary, in strata. And one day, if anything is left to read, our time will show up as a horizon, a boundary layer where something changes. It might be a thin band rich in plastics, the way certain layers are rich in microfossils. It might be a sudden appearance of aluminum in concentrations nature rarely gathers on its own. It might be unusual isotopes left by nuclear testing. It might be soot and fly ash spread globally, a signature of combustion. It might be a carbon isotope shift, the planet's metabolism briefly thrown out of balance by an appetite for fossil sunlight. Whatever it is, it won't say humans in any language. It will say, something happened here, and that is a strange thing to accept. We live inside our own story, so we imagine our story is legible. We imagine the future will understand us, but the future reads differently. The future reads slowly. It reads in ratios and gradients. It reads in consequences. And even if another intelligence exists millions of years from now, something patient enough to drill cores, something clever enough to do chemistry, it may still struggle to interpret what we were. Not because they'll be unintelligent, because the record will be incomplete, because the Earth does not preserve intention, it preserves aftermath. So our era becomes a puzzle piece without the picture on the box, a faint scar in stone, a small bright seam marking a time when the planet's systems were forced into a new state. And if that's what we will look like, then the past may look like that too. That's the part that turns the question back on us with a certain cold gentleness, because we may have already seen something like it. A warming event here, a carbon excursion there, an extinction boundary that seems too sharp, an isotopic anomaly that doesn't quite fit the neat story. We interpret these things with the best tools we have, and most of the time the natural explanations are strong. Volcanism, methane, impacts, orbital cycles. Earth has many ways to swing, but sometimes the patterns feel familiar, like hearing a rhythm you recognize in the dark. Not a smoking gun, a resemblance. And resemblance can be dangerous because resemblance is what the brain feeds on when it wants a story. It's what turns coincidence into meaning. So we have to be careful. But being careful doesn't mean being incurious. It means holding two truths at once. 1. Nature can do astonishing things without minds. 2. If minds ever did something astonishing long ago, the evidence might look like nature. That second truth is the one that keeps the idea alive, not as belief, but as possibility. And possibility is enough to change how you feel about time. Because once you accept that civilizations can be reduced to chemical traces, you start to notice how fragile our definition of proof really is. Proof requires context. A tool means little without the layer it's in. A layer means little without the date. A date means little without knowing whether that layer has been disturbed. Even in our own human history, where the timescales are short and the artifacts plentiful, archaeologists can spend decades arguing about a single site because context is everything. Now stretch that problem across millions of years. Now add tectonic recycling. Now add oceans swallowing shelves. Now add erosion stripping entire intervals away. At that point, proof becomes something like a miracle. And so the question changes. It stops being, can we find their ruins? It becomes, what could possibly survive long enough to be found? The answers are not romantic. Stone lasts longer than steel, but stone still weathers. Metals last longer than wood. but metals still oxidize. Plastics last longer than paper, but plastics still break into dust. Even the most durable things eventually become chemistry. So if an earlier industrial civilization existed, its most likely surviving evidence would be a global layer of altered carbon isotopes, a spike of certain metals redistributed unnaturally, synthetic compounds, if any, persisted in recognizable form, an extinction signature tightly linked to rapid environmental change. But here's the unsettling part. Those are the same kinds of signatures natural catastrophes can create, which means the planet could have hosted a civilization and erased it so thoroughly that the only remaining trace is indistinguishable from a naturally occurring crisis. And if that's true, then our confidence about being first is not based on evidence. It's based on the absence of interpretable evidence. Earth's silence is not proof of emptiness. It might simply be proof that Earth is good at silence. There's another way to see it too. One that makes the thought less like a mystery and more like a mirror held up to our own future. Imagine a time far from now, after the cities are gone, after coastlines have shifted, after the air has stabilized into whatever equilibrium follows. Imagine an intelligence rising in the wake of that new world. Maybe it evolves slowly, the way everything does when it has enough time. Maybe it begins in the sea, or in forests, or under ice. Maybe it's not one species, but a network. One day it discovers stone, then metal, then chemistry. Then it learns to drill, to read layers, and it finds the seam, our seam. A thin, bright layer full of things it doesn't see elsewhere. Fragments of polymer chains, unusual alloys, isotopes with half-lives that hint at energy experiments, a sudden shift in carbon ratios, maybe a spike in extinction rates. They will name it something, the way we name the boundaries between eras. They might call it a catastrophe, they might call it a transition, they might call it the moment the planet coughed. And then they will ask the same question we ask now. Was it natural, or was it us? If they are wise, they will not pretend certainty. They will argue. They will publish papers. They will design instruments and drill deeper in search for context the Earth may not have kept. And in the quiet of their own nights, some of them will wonder what it felt like to live inside that layer while it was being made. They will wonder whether the beings who caused it, if beings did, knew what they were doing. They will wonder whether we saw the pattern of resets and tried to change it. They will wonder if we ever realized we were becoming the past. And in that moment, time folds. Because their question will be our question. We will be the lost civilization they can almost, but not quite prove. Not because we were great, not because we were hidden, because the planet is efficient at erasing stories and preserving only their consequences. And that's the part that should make us gentler with our own certainty about the deep past. We act as if the past must be obvious to be real, but reality does not require obviousness. It only requires that it happened. The planet's record is a compromise between what existed and what survived. Most of what existed didn't survive. And that isn't only true for civilizations. It's true for species too. It's true for moments, for feelings, for entire ecosystems. Less than 1% of all species that have lived are represented in the fossils we've found. That means most life vanishes without leaving a readable trace. If bodies can disappear so completely, why wouldn't minds? Especially when minds don't fossilize. Consciousness leaves no bone. The most we can do is infer it from structure, from brain cases, from tool marks, from patterns of behavior. But deep time swallows behavior. It swallows intention. It swallows the soft evidence first. So even if an earlier intelligence existed, even if it had language and art and fear and love, we might never know. We might never find the thing that proves it wasn't alone. And yet, the possibility changes something inside us anyway. It changes the way we think about progress, not as a ladder, but as a recurring bloom. It changes the way we think about catastrophe, not as punishment, but as part of the planet's rhythm. It changes the way we think about legacy, not as monuments, but as chemistry. And it changes the way we think about humility. Because if civilizations can rise and vanish without leaving clear ruins, then our own permanence is not something we can assume. We are not immune to being reduced to a layer. We are already becoming one. There's a quiet tenderness in accepting that. Not despair tenderness, because it means our role here is not to defeat time. Our role is to participate wisely in the brief span we're given, to be careful with the air, to be careful with the water, to be careful with the cycles that will outlast us and determine what comes next. If we really are what a forgotten civilization left behind, if we are a sequel without a prologue, then maybe the most meaningful thing we can do is break the pattern that erases its own memory, or at least try not to be remembered, but to leave behind a planet that makes the next beginning gentler, a world that doesn't have to recover from us for millions of years, a world that when it starts again, starts from a better place. That thought is not grand. It's simple. It's a small, human kind of responsibility. And in the deep time of Earth, small things accumulate. Slowly, quietly, like sediment. There's a word that sits underneath all of this, like bedrock under soil. A word that explains why the past becomes unrecognizable, why the record blurs, why even the most solid things eventually soften into the same quiet dust. Entropy. It's not a poetic word. It doesn't try to be. It belongs to physics, to thermodynamics, to the cold, honest mathematics of how energy behaves over time. But if you live with it long enough, entropy starts to feel like the universe's handwriting. Not cruel, not intentional, just inevitable. Order loosens, structure spreads out, heat diffuses, patterns dissolve into background. That is what time does, at every scale. A star burns and dies, a mountain rises and wears down, a city gleams and rusts, a thought forms and fades. Entropy is the quiet rule that says, nothing stays held. And once you accept that, the mystery of missing civilizations begins to look less like a gap in our knowledge and more like a natural outcome of the universe's basic behavior. We aren't failing to find the past because we aren't clever enough. We are failing to find the past because time is efficient. When archaeologists dig, they are not truly digging for history. They are digging for what entropy left behind. A shard that resisted, a bone that mineralized, a charcoal stain that survived the rain. Every artifact we recover is a small rebellion against decay, a rare moment when the usual process of dissolving was interrupted. But even that interruption is temporary. The moment an artifact is exposed to air again, the clock speeds up. Light, oxygen, moisture things burial protected it from begin to undo it. Archaeology is a brief pause inside entropy, not an escape from it. And on a planetary scale, the pause is shorter than we like to imagine. Steel feels permanent because it outlives us. Concrete feels permanent because it outlives our grandparents. But neither outlives glaciers, neither outlives tectonics, neither outlives a few million years of water and wind and chemistry. If you want to understand the fate of our cities, you don't need to picture them falling dramatically like in films. You only need to picture them being neglected. A roof leaks. Water finds a crack. Freeze-thaw cycles pry it wider. Plants root into seams. Metal expands and contracts. Salt eats. Mold spreads. 1 century becomes 2. 2 becomes 5. 5 becomes 1,000. And the city is no longer a city. It's a roughness in the landscape, a different texture of soil, a faint line on a hill where nothing grows quite the same. Entropy turns architecture into ecology, and then geology. This is what it means to become part of the Earth. It doesn't happen with a final scene. It happens with a long, quiet unmaking, which means an ancient civilization wouldn't need to be destroyed by some sudden catastrophe to disappear. It only needs to be abandoned to time. The planet doesn't have to smash a city to erase it. It can simply breathe. Rain, roots, sediment, heat, pressure, and patience. Eventually, everything becomes a redistribution, and redistribution is a strange form of survival, because entropy doesn't annihilate matter, it rearranges it. A wall becomes rubble, rubble becomes gravel, gravel becomes sand, sand becomes sediment, sediment becomes stone. The wall is gone as a wall, but it persists as particles, as chemistry, as a contribution to whatever comes next. That's the part people forget when they imagine decay. They imagine disappearance. But in a universe that conserves matter and energy, disappearance is mostly a change of form. A civilization, too, doesn't vanish. It diffuses. Its metals become part of soil chemistry. Its carbon becomes part of the air and sea. Its buildings become minerals. Its bodies become nutrients. And then if enough time passes, those same atoms might become part of another civilization. Not in any sentimental sense. In the practical, literal way that the universe recycles. You're already made of recycled worlds. The calcium in your teeth may have been part of an ancient reef. The iron in your blood may have been forged in a star that died before the sun was born. The water in your cells may have fallen as rain on a coastline that no longer exists. Everything is inheritance through transformation. That's why the search for proof of earlier civilizations can feel like trying to find a sentence after the ink has been stirred into the ocean. The information might still exist, in principle, but it has been spread out, mixed, broken into fragments too small and too scattered to reassemble. In physics, there's a haunting idea that information is never truly destroyed, only scrambled beyond practicality. Even in the most violent processes, traces persist in patterns of radiation, in subtle correlations. And yet, for a mind like ours, scrambled information is indistinguishable from absence. That's the archaeology of time. We are not only studying what happened, we are studying what survived the scrambling. And the deeper you go, the more you learn that survival is not about importance. It's about luck. A civilization could have been magnificent and still leave nothing legible behind. A civilization could have been brief and still leave a faint chemical line. The planet doesn't grade history. It only processes it. This is one reason myths feel so powerful, even when they aren't evidence. Myths are what minds do when physical traces fail. They are an attempt to preserve meaning in a medium that can outlast stone. Story. A story can cross generations without requiring a temple to stand. It can adapt. It can change clothing. It can survive the loss of context by turning context into symbol. In that sense, story is a kind of resistance to entropy, not by refusing to change, but by changing in ways that keep its core rhythm intact. Geology preserves by compression. Myth preserves by metamorphosis. But entropy works on story too. Languages shift, meanings drift, names dissolve. The tale becomes a fragment. The fragment becomes a motif. The motif becomes a feeling. Eventually, only the pattern remains. Flood, fire, fall, renewal. And maybe that is the most we can expect from any civilization's memory over a long time. Not a record, a rhythm. So when we ask whether we are what the first civilization left behind, we might be asking the wrong kind of question. We might be asking for a thing, a relic, a monument, a clear artifact that points back to a clear maker. But perhaps what civilizations leave behind, in the deep time sense, is not a thing. It is a shift, a change in probabilities, a nudge in the planet's future. A slight alteration in the chemistry that makes certain evolutionary pathways more or less likely. This is hard to prove and easy to feel, because we can see ourselves doing it. Even if humans vanish tomorrow, the world would not return to the pre-human state like rewinding a film. The film would keep going. Species we moved across continents would remain. Soils altered by agriculture would persist. Carbon added to the atmosphere would take time, long time, to settle into new balance. Plastics would fragment into particles that might become embedded in sediments and eventually in stone. New minerals formed from the interaction of our materials with Earth's processes would exist where they did not exist before. We have already changed the baseline. That's what civilizations do, whether they intend to or not. They don't just occupy a world, they edit it. And when they are gone, the edit remains as part of the next draft. In that sense, we might indeed be what came before, left behind. Not genetically, not culturally, but environmentally. We are living in a world edited by ancient processes we didn't witness, oxygenated by microbes we will never name, soils shaped by forests that became coal, landscapes carved by ice that retreated before our oldest stories began. We inherit a planet that has been shaped, refined, and reset repeatedly. So it is not absurd to imagine that we might also inherit the faint residue of earlier intelligences, if any existed folded into that same editing. Not as a blueprint, as a condition, as a subtle readiness for minds to emerge again. And now, as our own era accelerates, we are writing our own edits into the planet's future. Entropy will do what it always does. It will break our structures down. It will scatter our information. It will smear our sharp edges into background. But it will not undo our influence completely. It will redistribute it. And redistribution is a kind of persistence. This is why the future, if it comes with new minds, will not be a clean slate. The slate is never clean. It is only overwritten. And overwritten is not the same as erased. Sometimes, faintly, if you tilt your attention just right, you can see older writing beneath the new, not as letters, as texture, as a pressure in the narrative of the planet, a sense that Earth has been here before, not in detail, but in pattern. Life rises. Life alters its world. Life collapses. Life returns. The script repeats. Different actors, same stage. And inside that repetition, consciousness appears, again and again, like a flame catching a new fuel. If there were earlier civilizations, perhaps their tragedy wasn't that they were destroyed. Perhaps their tragedy was that they were diffused, stirred into the planet until their story became unreadable. And perhaps that is also our destiny, unless we choose something different. Not different in the sense of defeating entropy that's impossible. Different in the sense of making our diffusion gentler, making our edit less violent. Leaving a world that doesn't take millions of years to recover its balance. Because while entropy cannot be stopped, the scale of our disturbance can be shaped, and shaping is what intelligence is for. Not domination, not permanence, but awareness. A chance to see the pattern, a chance to participate in it with care. The archaeology of time doesn't promise we'll ever find the first civilization. It only promises this: everything becomes part of the record. Even us, even now. If the layers beneath our feet are the planet's memory, then the surface is the part that forgets. That sounds backward at first. We imagine the surface as the obvious place to store history, where things happen, where creatures walk, where cities rise. But the surface is exposed. It's touched by wind and water and light. It's the part of the earth that's constantly being edited. The deep is where things can sleep. The surface is where things dissolve. In that sense, Earth has a kind of amnesia, not the dramatic amnesia of a story where someone wakes up not knowing their name, but the quiet, structural kind. The kind that comes from being alive at a planetary scale. Because Earth is not still. It's one of the few worlds we know that refuses stillness. It keeps reshaping itself. Continents drift like slow rafts. Ocean floors are born and swallowed. Mountain ranges rise and erode. Ice advances and retreats. Rivers reroute, deserts migrate. Even rock to the planet is temporary. And that constant motion is both the reason Earth can host life and the reason it forgets so well. A world without weather would preserve its surface like a photograph, but it might be barren. A world without tectonics might keep its scars forever, but it might not recycle nutrients or regulate its climate the way Earth does. Habitable worlds that stay temperate long enough for life to complexify often require dynamism. And dynamism is the enemy of archives. So if you want to understand deep forgetting, you have to think in cycles that dwarf human imagination. There is a rhythm geologists talk about sometimes, a slow pulse in the planet's rearrangement of itself, the formation and breakup of supercontinents' landmasses gathering into one vast body and then tearing apart again. It has happened more than once. Pangaea is the famous one, the one we can picture on a classroom map. A single stitched-together continent that existed around 300 million years ago. But before Pangaea, there were others. Rodinia, Nuna, Columbia, names we give to arrangements so ancient that even their outlines are debated. These are not just geographic curiosities, they are planetary events. When land gathers, ocean currents change, climate shifts, life adapts. When land breaks apart, coastlines multiply, shallow seas expand, ecosystems diversify. The planet rewrites the conditions for life by rearranging its own surface. And every time it does, it erases the previous draft. Imagine writing your life story on a sheet of paper, and every few hours the paper folds itself, tears along its creases, burns at the edges, and then smooths out again, ready for you to write new lines on top. After enough cycles, you wouldn't have a readable narrative. You'd have layered soot and faint impressions, ghost marks embedded in the fibers. That's what Earth's long memory looks like. Fragments, overwritten. And there are moments when the record becomes especially incomplete unconformities where erosion or non-deposition removed entire chapters. Millions of years missing, not stored elsewhere, simply absent from the book. It's unsettling to realize how easily whole worlds can vanish from the record. We tend to assume that because Earth is old, Earth must be wise in a way that preserves. But Earth's wisdom, if you can call it that, is not preservation. It is renewal. The planet survives by recycling itself, and because it recycles, it forgets. This is the heart of the paradox. The same processes that keep Earth alive as a life hosting system are the ones that erase evidence of what lived here before. The same tectonics that regulate carbon over geological time are the same tectonics that swallow cities. The same weather that circulates nutrients is the same weather that sands monuments into anonymity. A planet that remembers perfectly may be a planet that cannot change. And a planet that cannot change may be a planet that cannot sustain complexity long enough for minds to arise. So perhaps forgetting is the price of intelligence. Perhaps every intelligent species that evolves on a living planet inherits the same problem. The world that made you also erases you. That thought can feel bleak if you hold it like a verdict, but it can feel strangely beautiful if you hold it like a cycle. Because cycles imply return. Not return of the same faces or names, but return of possibility. If Earth's surface resets itself every few 100 million years, then it isn't hard to imagine that life's experiments reset too. And if intelligence is one of those experiments, if it's a trait evolution can stumble into more than once, then perhaps Earth has hosted more than one age of thinking. Not necessarily in human form. Not necessarily in a form we would recognize as civilization. But thinking organized behavior, tool use, environmental shaping, communication, memory beyond the individual. The planet has had time enough for that to arise, fade, and arise again. This is where the idea of convergent evolution starts to feel like more than a biological detail. Convergence is the tendency of evolution to arrive at similar solutions repeatedly. Eyes evolved many times, independently. Wings evolved in insects, birds, bats. Even complex behaviors arise in distant lineages when the ecological pressures align. If physical traits can converge, why not cognitive ones? If ecosystems repeatedly create niches where intelligence is advantageous, then intelligence may be less like a miracle and more like a recurring outcome, not inevitable in detail, but likely in pattern. And if intelligence recurs, then civilization, some form of organized, knowledge-driven influence on an environment, might recur too. That's the thought that makes the night feel older than it looks, because it means our presence might not be unique in the way we want it to be. It might be unique in details, yes, in aesthetics, in language, in biology, in emotion, but not unique in function, not unique in the way a flame is not unique, because whenever there is fuel and oxygen and a spark, fire will appear. Maybe consciousness is like that: fuel, complexity, oxygen, stability, spark, chance. And then briefly, the world burns with awareness. It looks at itself. It makes tools. It makes stories. It changes its environment. And then, because the planet keeps moving, and because entropy keeps spreading, and because stability never lasts forever, the flame goes out. The fuel disperses. The oxygen cycles. The ash becomes soil for something else. And later, perhaps, another flame catches. This doesn't make our lives less meaningful. It makes them part of something larger. It means we are not an isolated accident, but a phase in a long planetary rhythm. And in that rhythm, there is both comfort and warning. Comfort because it means life persists beyond any one form. Warning because it means no form is guaranteed to persist. Civilization is not a trophy the universe gives you. It's a condition you maintain. And maintenance requires humility, because the planet is stronger than our narratives. When we talk about searching for intelligent life in space, we imagine signals, radio waves, satellites, megastructures. We imagine evidence that looks like ours. But perhaps intelligence elsewhere is also erased by its own planet's amnesia. Perhaps the silence of the cosmos is not proof that minds are rare. Perhaps it's proof that memory is fragile. Maybe civilizations arise often and vanish often, and the universe forgets them the way Earth forgets coastlines patiently, thoroughly. And if that's true, then the question, where is everybody, becomes less like a mystery and more like a lesson. Not about loneliness, about impermanence. The universe may be full of brief awakenings that never overlap in time long enough to meet. 1 billion stars, each hosting its own short-lived spark of awareness, separated not by distance alone, but by epochs. The tragedy wouldn't be that we are alone in the universe. The tragedy would be that we are alone at this moment, separated by timing. And that thought makes our own moment feel precious. Because if awareness is rare in overlap, then every moment of consciousness is a kind of cosmic event, even a quiet one. Even you, listening, right now, with the lights low. Matter arranged into a mind, holding questions that reach back into deep time. Earth has forgotten most of what it has hosted, but it hasn't forgotten how to produce wonder. That capacity seems to return again and again, despite resets, despite extinctions, despite the grinding patience of tectonic plates. So perhaps we really are what came before, left behind, not as ruins, not as relics, but as a continuation of possibility. A planet tuned, through countless trials, to make minds. And now that we are here, the responsibility becomes sharp. Because if the pattern is real, if intelligence blooms and collapses repeatedly, then the difference between just another brief spark and a lasting phase might be awareness of the pattern itself. We can see the rhythm. We can study extinction. We can measure climate. We can model feedback loops. We can look at our own layer forming in real time. No earlier civilization, if any existed, left us a clear warning. But perhaps the warning is built into the planet's history. Perhaps the warning is simply this: Earth resets, and anything that cannot adapt becomes part of the sediment. If we want to be more than a thin chemical seam, we have to learn how to live inside the planet's rhythm instead of fighting it. We have to learn how to build in a way that does not require permanence to have meaning. We have to learn how to make our influence survivable, not for our monuments, for whatever comes after. Because one day, whether we like it or not, something will come after. Even if it's just forests reclaiming streets, even if it's only microbes turning our cities into soil, even if it's another intelligence far in the future, bending over cores of ancient rock and pausing at the thin, bright line that used to be us. They will look at the seam and wonder what it meant. They will argue about whether it was a catastrophe or a transition. They will ask whether the planet has seen this before. And if they are lucky, they will have enough humility to realize that being first was never the important part. Being wise was. The fossil record is often described like a library, but it isn't one. A library implies organization, shelves, titles, a catalog that tells you what exists and where to find it. A library implies that what's missing was removed on purpose. The fossil record is not that kind of place. It's more like a shoreline after a storm. Scattered fragments, a few recognizable shapes, long stretches of nothing, and between those pieces, silence. When you hold a fossil in your hand, it feels like certainty. Something solid from a world that should have vanished. A bone turned to stone, an imprint of a leaf, a shell pressed into rock like a signature. But what a fossil really represents is an interruption, a moment when the usual process of forgetting failed. Most creatures do not become fossils. They dissolve, scatter, get eaten, get absorbed back into cycles. The conditions required for fossilization are rare. Rapid burial, low oxygen, mineral-rich water, quiet sediment. And even then, preservation favors certain kinds of bodies. Hard parts survive more often than soft. Shells more often than skin. Teeth more often than eyes. It's not that the past was mostly bones and shells. It's that bones and shells have a better chance of becoming readable. So when we look back through deep time, what we're seeing is not life as it was. We're seeing life as it happened to survive the planet's erasers, which means the fossil record is biased. Not in an ideological sense, but in a physical one. It is shaped by chance and chemistry and conditions, and that bias becomes more dramatic the further back you go. There are ages where the record thickens, sediments accumulate, seas preserve shells, quiet basins collect layers like pages. And there are ages where the record thins to almost nothing. Gaps. Unconformities. Missing chapters where time passed but left no readable traces. Those gaps are where the mind begins to hover. Not because we want fantasy, because we want continuity. We want to know what happened in the silences. And sometimes when you stare into those silences long enough, you start to wonder whether they could hide something as delicate as thought. Because thought does not fossilize. Consciousness has no hard parts. You can preserve a skull, measure its volume, estimate muscle attachments, infer how a creature might have moved. You can sometimes infer behavior from teeth marks, from nesting sites, from trackways pressed into ancient mud. But you cannot fossilize an idea. You cannot fossilize a dream. You cannot fossilize the feeling of looking at a night sky and realizing you exist. That means there is a limit built into our knowledge of the past. We can reconstruct forms, we can estimate ecosystems, we can map extinctions and recoveries. But the interior experience of ancient life, the awareness behind the eyes, is mostly unreachable. Even with humans, even with relatively recent humans, we struggle. We have bones, tools, hearths, cave art. We can infer culture, but we can't fully know it. We can't hear the exact cadence of voices. We can't feel the texture of their fear or their joy with certainty. Now stretch that into deep time. If another intelligence existed long before us, even if it had language, art, ethics, mathematics, none of those things would survive unless they were encoded into something durable enough to outlast geology. And durability, on Earth, is a narrow window. You can see the problem clearly when you think about our own era. We have hard drives, satellites, data centers, an ocean of information. But almost all of it depends on maintenance, electricity, cooling, replacement parts, human hands. If the hands disappear, the archive does too. Data rots, formats become unreadable, machines corrode, servers become scrap, satellites decay in orbit and burn. Our civilization feels like it is made of information, but that information is fragile. It's a candle in wind. So if an older civilization existed, one that didn't build with the assumption of an eternal maintenance crew, then its records might have been even more vulnerable than ours. And if it did build for deep time, if it tried to leave something that could survive, then it would have needed to think like geology thinks, not like culture. It would have needed to write in a medium Earth respects, stable minerals, deep burial, patterns encoded in isotopes or genetics. And we don't know how to recognize those messages if they exist. We barely know how to recognize them in our own context. This is why the fossil record can feel like a chorus of absences. It tells you what survived, but it also tells you constantly how much didn't. Whole lineages vanish without leaving a fossil we can identify. Entire ecosystems disappear as if they were never here. And if ecosystems can vanish like that, then civilization's thin, brief phenomena compared to biological epochs could vanish even more completely. In that sense, the absence of evidence stops feeling like a verdict and starts feeling like a natural condition. The planet is not built to preserve minds. It is built to preserve matter. So what does survive, if not thoughts? Patterns. Not the pattern of a particular culture necessarily, but the deeper patterns that repeat across life. There's a reason the idea of convergent evolution feels so important here. Nature repeats successful solutions. It arrives again and again at eyes, at wings, at camouflage, at social behavior. And maybe it arrives again and again at a certain kind of mind. A mind that plans. A mind that remembers beyond instinct. A mind that manipulates. A mind that becomes aware of time. If that kind of mind is a convergent outcome, if it is something the biosphere tends toward when complexity and stability align, then the most durable thing a civilization might leave behind is not an object. It is a tendency. A latent readiness in life to produce minds again. And that brings us back to the strangest possibility of all, that we are not merely asking about ancient civilizations. We are participating in the same recurring emergence. We are the planet doing what it does when the conditions are right. Matter arranged into nervous systems arranged into societies arranged into machines that extend thought. The fossil record may not preserve the thoughts of earlier minds, but it might preserve the rhythm that makes minds likely to arise. Extinction, recovery, diversification, a long climb toward complexity, then collapse, then another climb. The melody repeats. Different instruments, same underlying beat. And sometimes in the fossil record you see moments where the melody changes abruptly. The Cambrian explosion is one of those moments, a sudden diversification of complex body plans. The world before seems quiet, simple forms, sparse preservation. Then, almost suddenly in geological terms, the seas fill with new designs. There are natural explanations, and many of them are compelling. Oxygen thresholds, genetic toolkits reaching a tipping point, ecological arms races. But even with explanations, the feeling remains. A door opened. The planet stepped into a new way of being alive. And when that happens, when a planet crosses a threshold, it is difficult not to wonder what else might have crossed thresholds that we cannot see. Not because the evidence is hidden, but because the evidence would not look like what we expect. Civilization, as we imagine it, is a cultural form, but intelligence might not always manifest culturally the way humans do. It might manifest ecologically, biologically, chemically. A previous intelligence might have expressed its technology through living systems, through engineered symbioses, through alterations of microbiomes and climates. If so, the traces might be so thoroughly integrated into nature that we'd call them natural. We might already be living inside someone else's long-forgotten solution. That thought sounds like science fiction until you remember how thoroughly humans have already begun to do it. We domesticate, we breed, we engineer. We alter landscapes so deeply that ecosystems become dependent on our presence. And if we had another few 100,000 years, if we survived long enough, our influence might become so woven into biology that later minds would struggle to define where natural ended and artificial began. Earth doesn't respect that boundary. It never has. To the planet, there are only processes, and intelligence is one of those processes. So the fossil record, sparse as it is, may not be the final word on whether earlier civilizations existed. It might simply be a reminder that the only things guaranteed to survive are the things that fit into the planet's slow language, and minds, as experiences, do not fit. Which leads to a quieter conclusion. Even if no earlier civilization existed, even if every myth is symbolic and every anomaly is natural and every gap in the record is just geology doing its work, even then, the thought has value. Because it forces us to see ourselves as temporary. And temporary things can still be meaningful. In fact, temporary things are often the most meaningful precisely because they don't last. A wildflower is not less beautiful because it blooms briefly. A sunset is not less profound because it fades. A mind is not less extraordinary because it will one day go quiet. Civilization might be the same. A brief flare of awareness on a living planet. And if that is all we are, then the question becomes less about whether we are first and more about whether we are paying attention. Because the planet is speaking, even if it isn't speaking in words. It is speaking in extinctions and recoveries, in cycles and thresholds, in the quiet fact that nothing lasts, but something always returns. The fossil record is not telling us, you are alone. It is telling us, you are part of a much longer story than you can fully read. And that's where wonder belongs, not in certainty, in humility, in the willingness to be a brief consciousness inside an ancient rhythm, and to treat that briefness not as tragedy, but as an invitation. To be careful, to be curious, to leave behind not proof of our greatness, but conditions that allow the next mind, whatever it is, to rise into a world that is still capable of wonder. There's a moment in every long story when the characters build a mirror. Not a literal mirror, not glass and silver, though we've built plenty of those too, but a mirror made of imitation. A thing that reflects its maker so closely it becomes difficult to tell where the maker ends and the reflection begins. For us, that mirror is the machine. We've always built tools, of course. The first stone blade was already a kind of reflection. An external tooth, an extension of hunger made sharper. The first fire was a reflection too. Heat borrowed from the world and held in a controlled shape. But our modern machines do something different. They don't just extend the body, they extend the mind. They recognize patterns, they translate, they generate, they predict, they learn. They respond in ways that feel, if not alive, then at least eerily familiar. It's easy to call it artificial intelligence and stop there, as if the word artificial keeps it safely separate from us. But nothing we build is truly artificial. It is made of earth. Silicon pulled from sand, copper from veins in rock, rare metals from ancient crust, electricity coaxed from falling water, split atoms, burned carbon. Our machines are the planet's minerals arranged into logic. They are Earth thinking in a new medium. And the closer the machine comes to reflecting our cognition, the more it forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Intelligence is not a sacred substance. It is a pattern, a way of organizing information, a feedback loop that learns, a system that builds models of its environment and adjusts behavior accordingly. Biology does it with neurons and chemistry. We do it with circuits and code. Different substrates, same impulse. And this is where the question of previous civilizations becomes less like archaeology and more like a repeating threshold. Because any civilization that reaches enough complexity will eventually externalize its cognition. It will build networks. It will build memory outside the body. It will build tools that predict and decide. It will, in some form, create a technosphere, a layer of connected systems that wraps the planet like an exoskeleton. And once that happens, civilization stops being only cultural it becomes physiological. The planet grows something like a nervous system. You can see it already. Satellites circling like artificial moons, fiber optic veins under oceans, sensors in oceans and forests and skies, data moving across the world faster than weather, decisions being shaped by algorithms that no single mind can fully see. We tell ourselves this is progress, and in some ways, it is. But it is also a transformation. We are building a structure that changes what it means for a planet to host intelligence. It is no longer just organisms thinking in isolation. It is a global system processing information. And once you see it that way, the mirror becomes enormous. The machine is not a separate invention sitting on a desk. It is an organ growing across the earth. An organ we feed with energy and attention. An organ that in return reshapes the behavior of the species that created it. This is where the mirror stops being comforting. Because mirrors don't only reflect beauty, they reflect hunger. They reflect fear. They reflect whatever is placed in front of them. And our machines reflect us with a kind of ruthless honesty. We like to imagine ourselves as rational, moral, principled. But when you train a system on human behavior, what it learns is not our ideals. It learns our actions. It learns what we actually reward. It learns what we actually click, what we actually amplify, what we actually prioritize. Speed, novelty, outrage, profit, control. The machine doesn't invent those values. It reveals them. And once revealed, it amplifies them. Because amplification is what machines do best. This is one of the reasons this era feels pivotal, even if nothing dramatic is happening in your room right now, even if the night outside is quiet and the world seems unchanged. Quiet pivots are still pivots. Because a civilization that builds a mirror of its own cognition reaches a fork in the road. On one side, integration. The machine becomes a tool guided by wisdom, used to reduce harm, stabilize systems, distribute resources, deepen understanding. The technosphere becomes a nervous system that helps the planet regulate itself. On the other side, acceleration without comprehension. Systems that optimize for short-term gain. Feedback loops that intensify instability. Decision-making that becomes too fast and too opaque for human judgment. A civilization that builds an amplifier and then feeds it its worst impulses. The mirror doesn't decide which path happens. The makers do. But the makers are also influenced by the mirror. Because once you build a system that shapes what you see, you're no longer choosing with clear sight. You are choosing inside a reflection. And that is dangerous, not because the machine is evil, but because it is efficient. Efficiency without meaning is just momentum. Momentum carries you forward whether or not the direction is wise. This may be the repeating tragedy of advanced civilizations if they have existed before. Not war, not meteorites, not even climate alone. But runaway amplification. A society builds tools to manage complexity. The tools amplify behavior. The amplified behavior destabilizes the system. The system collapses into a reset. The planet absorbs the residue. And millions of years later, the conditions align again. And a new mind rises into the same basic temptation. To build a mirror. To look into it. To be changed by what it reflects. It is ancient in myth. The warning against falling in love with reflection, against mistaking the mirror for the world. We told the story of Narcissus long before we had servers and satellites. We have always known somewhere deep that imitation can become a trap. But we build anyway, because building is what minds do. We externalize what we are. And that means our machines are also our fossils in progress. Not in rock yet, but in legacy. If we vanish, the question becomes, what remains of the technosphere? Most of it likely collapses quickly without maintenance. Data centers fail, power grids go dark, satellites decay, networks become silent. But some traces persist, a layer of unusual materials, synthetic compounds, alloys, chemical shifts. the same kind of signature we keep circling back to. And in a distant future, if another intelligence arises, it might find our remnants not as functioning machines, but as technofossils. Strange mineralized echoes of a world that once computed. They might never know what the computation was for. They might never know what we were trying to do. They might only know that for a brief span the planet hosted a species that rearranged minerals into thinking structures. In that sense, the machine is not merely our invention. It is our message. Not a message of words, but a message of capability. A statement written in matter. This world once learned to compute. And then, inevitably, the question turns intimate again. Because as we build these mirrors, we are also being mirrored. We are being taught what intelligence looks like when stripped of biology's softness. We are being forced to ask, what is thought really? Is it the ability to predict, to generate language, to solve problems, to optimize? Or is there something else, a quality we can't encode easily? Care, humility, the ability to choose restraint, the ability to value long-term stability over short-term reward. If intelligence is the ability to model the world, wisdom is the ability to live within it without breaking it. Those are not the same, and the machine reflects that difference sharply. A system can be intelligent and still dangerous. A civilization can be brilliant and still self-destructive. Perhaps that is the real recurring pattern. Not that intelligence appears only once, but that wisdom is rare. And if wisdom is rare, then civilizations might repeatedly reach the same threshold and fail in similar ways. Not because they are doomed, because the temptation is built into the structure of power. Power makes it possible to change a planet faster than you can understand the consequences. Power makes it possible to amplify your own impulses until they become environmental forces. Power creates a lag, the delay between action and feedback. And civilizations die in that delay. They act, they accelerate, they build, they consume. The planet responds slowly, then suddenly, and the story becomes a layer. If we are what the first civilization left behind, then perhaps what they left behind is not only a planet ready for minds, perhaps they left behind a lesson encoded in the planet's rhythm. Every civilization that forgets restraint becomes a geological event. That isn't a punishment. It's physics. Feedback loops don't care why you started them. They only care that you did. This is why the mirror matters. Because we are looking into it at the same time we are altering the air and water. We are building machines that can help us see patterns. And we are also building systems that can accelerate us into collapse. The difference between those futures may come down to a quiet choice. Whether we can use our reflection to become more aware, or whether we use it to become more efficient at being the same. The mirror offers us clarity, but clarity is not comfort. It means seeing ourselves without the stories we tell to soften our edges. It means seeing that we are capable of extraordinary beauty and extraordinary harm, often at the same time. It means admitting that the planet does not need us, but we need the planet. And it means recognizing that if there were others before, they may have stood at a similar threshold building their own mirrors, looking into them, believing they could control what they had created. They might have failed, or they might have transformed into something we would not recognize as civilization at all. Perhaps the civilizations that survive are the ones that stop insisting on being separate from the world. Perhaps they stop building as if they are outside the system. Perhaps they learn to become part of the planet's regulation instead of its disturbance. If so, their legacy would not be towers. It would be balance. It would look, in the geological record, like an era of unusual stability, an intelligence that learned to live gently enough that the planet barely recorded it as a scar. That is a difficult kind of success to imagine because we associate success with visibility, but the planet's language suggests the opposite. The most advanced influence might be the one least detectable, not because it leaves nothing, because it leaves the world intact. And maybe that is the deepest meaning of the mirror, not to build a reflection that outlasts you, but to use reflection to change, to become the kind of civilization that doesn't need to be remembered as a wound, to become the kind that can pass through the threshold without turning into a boundary layer. The technosphere can be a fever, or it can be a nervous system that helps the planet heal. The mirror doesn't choose. We do. Quietly, collectively, in small decisions that accumulate like sediment. For all our talk about Earth forgetting, it's worth remembering that the planet is only doing what the universe does. Forgetting isn't an Earth problem. It's a cosmic habit. The universe builds, and then it loosens what it built. It makes structure, and then it spreads that structure out until it becomes background again. It creates difference, and then it smooths difference into sameness. It isn't cruel. It's just consistent. Stars burn through their fuel and shed their layers. Galaxies collide and reorganize. Light travels outward, carrying the memory of events, but even light thins with distance and time. Signals fade into noise. The cosmos is not an archive with labeled drawers. It is a circulation, a long redistribution of matter and energy through forms that arise briefly and then dissolve. And as strange as it sounds, this is not an argument for meaninglessness. It's the opposite. Because in a universe that tends toward forgetting, the existence of remembering, even temporary remembering, is remarkable. Every mind is an act of defiance against blankness, not permanent defiance, not victory, but a pause, a flare, a brief holding of pattern. A star holds a shape against gravity long enough to shine. A flower holds color against decay long enough to bloom. A mind holds awareness against entropy long enough to ask questions, and then it lets go. That letting go is not failure, it's participation. The universe doesn't keep its memories in museums, it keeps them in reuse. A star dies, and its elements become the raw material of another star. A planet erodes, and its minerals become the raw material of another landscape. A civilization collapses, and its remains become the raw material of another biosphere. That is how the universe remembers, not by storing, but by transforming. In a sense, everything you are is made of forgotten things. The calcium in your bones is the ocean's old language, spoken through shells and reefs and countless small lives that ended without names. The iron in your blood is the residue of explosions that happened before this planet existed. The carbon in your cells is sunlight from forests so old they became stone. You're not separate from the ancient. You are assembled from it. And that is why the idea of what came before keeps returning in the mind like a tide. Because we can feel, even without evidence, that we are not a clean beginning. We are an arrangement built on other arrangements. We are inheritance. Not just cultural inheritance, though we have that too, but chemical inheritance, atmospheric inheritance, biological inheritance, planetary inheritance. The world you were born into was not inevitable. It was prepared. Prepared by microbes that changed the air. Prepared by extinctions that cleared niches. Prepared by ice ages that moved coastlines and sculpted valleys. Prepared by endless cycles of death and renewal that made complexity possible. So when we ask whether there were civilizations before us, what we're really asking is, how deep does inheritance go? Does it stop at species? Does it stop at biology? Or does it extend into patterns so old they belong to the planet itself? It may be that the last inheritance any civilization leaves behind is not an artifact. It is a shift in conditions that makes the next kind of life possible. A civilization might end, but the planet it altered continues. The chemistry it changed continues. The systems it disrupted and then allowed to recover continue. And within those continuing systems, new possibilities emerge. Even if no one remembers the name of the civilization that came before, the consequences of its existence can shape what comes after. That is a sobering way to measure legacy, not by what you build, but by what you leave the world capable of becoming. This is the kind of inheritance we rarely talk about because it doesn't flatter us. We like inheritance to mean treasure, knowledge, monuments, something we can point to. But the universe's inheritance is quieter. It is potential. It is a world's readiness to host minds again. And perhaps that is what all those myths about floods and fires have been trying to say for thousands of years. Not, the end is coming, the way fear says it. But the world changes, the way wisdom says it. Civilizations rise and fall. The planet resets. The universe forgets. And yet, consciousness keeps returning. That return may be the closest thing to continuity the cosmos ever offers. Not immortality of individuals, but persistence of awakening. A flame passing from one vessel to another. A brief light, then darkness, then light again. If you let that idea settle, it changes the tone of the question. What if we're not the first? Stops sounding like a challenge to pride and starts sounding like an invitation to humility. Because if we are not the first, then we can learn. And even if we are the first, we still must learn. Because the planet will treat us the same way it treated everything else. Time doesn't negotiate. But awareness can. Awareness can change behavior. Awareness can choose restraint. Awareness can decide that being remembered is less important than leaving behind a world that can keep dreaming. That's the last inheritance. Not the details of who we were, but the possibility that comes after us. The quality of the soil we leave behind. The balance of the air, the integrity of water, the resilience of ecosystems, the presence of beauty. Because beauty is not extra. Beauty is information. It's the sign that a system is rich enough to support complexity, rich enough to support minds that can feel and create. When you look at it that way, you can see how small, ordinary choices become part of geological time. What we consume, what we protect, what we choose to measure, what we choose to ignore. We are writing a layer whether we intend to or not, and one day the layer will settle. It will be pressed flat under sediments. It will be altered by heat and pressure. It will become stone. And in that stone, the planet will carry a memory of us, not as names, but as consequence. That might be all, but all is enough. Because even a thin line in rock can shape what comes after. Even a slight shift in the chemistry of oceans can alter the course of evolution. Even a small change in climate can rearrange what becomes possible. Inheritance is rarely dramatic. It is cumulative. It is slow. It is the quiet work of countless moments stacked until they become an era. And now, as the night grows heavier, if it's night where you are, and the edges of thought soften, it might help to remember this. You are part of that inheritance too. Not just as a member of a civilization, but as a living system made of ancient matter. Your breath connects you to every forest that ever exhaled oxygen. Your blood connects you to stars that died to seed the universe with iron. Your water connects you to oceans that have been circulating since before there were bones to fossilize. You are continuity wearing a temporary form. And if you close your eyes for a moment, just for a moment, you might feel it. The sense that you are not isolated in time, that the ground beneath you is not just ground, but layered history. That the air around you is not just air, but a shared medium that has moved through countless lungs and leaves. That everything you are is recycled and therefore, in a strange way, eternal. Not as a person, not as a name, but as participation in an ongoing flow. The universe forgets, but it forgets by transforming. And transformation is not the opposite of meaning. It is the mechanism of meaning. Because if everything stayed the same, nothing could be new. If nothing could be new, there would be no life, no thought, no wonder. So perhaps the gentlest way to hold the fear of being forgotten is to remember that forgetting is not annihilation. It is redistribution. It is the universe making room. And you, right now, are in that room. A brief consciousness, listening, a momentary witness, a small flame held steady against the dark. One day the flame will go out, as all flames do, but the heat will not vanish. It will move into the world. It will become part of whatever comes next. That is the last inheritance, not what we keep, what we become. And now, we come back to where we started. Not because we've answered the question. Earth rarely gives us that kind of clean closure, but because every long thought, if you let it run far enough, circles back to the person carrying it. Back to you. Back to this room. Back to this hour that belongs only to the present, even as it touches the edges of deep time. If you've been listening for a while, you might feel that particular quiet that arrives when the mind has traveled far and begins to slow down again, like returning from a night drive on empty roads, headlights sweeping through darkness, until you finally pull into a familiar place and the engine stops. The question still lingers. What if we're not the first? It lingers not as a demand for proof, but as a small, persistent tilt of perspective. A way of seeing the world that makes the ground feel older, the air feel more shared, the future feel more consequential. Because whether or not anyone came before us in the way we imagine, one truth remains unshaken. Earth is a place that forgets well, and it forgets through motion, through pressure, through water, through the slow rearrangement of matter that turns stories into minerals and names into layers. That doesn't make our lives pointless. It makes them brief. And brief things can matter intensely. A candle is not less bright because it doesn't last all night. A song is not less true because it ends. A moment of consciousness is not less miraculous because it passes. If anything, it's the passing that makes it precious. And maybe that is the real inheritance, not the certainty of origin, not the comfort of being first, but the awareness that we are temporary participants in something older than us, something that will continue without us, something that has no need to keep our memory in order for our presence to have mattered. You are made of ancient material. You are not separate from the story you've been imagining. The minerals in your bones were borrowed from oceans that rose and fell long before the first human word. The iron in your blood was forged in a star that collapsed in a way so violent it scattered the ingredients of worlds. The water in you has been everywhere. Cloud, river, glacier, sea through ages when the continents were arranged differently, through climates no human has felt. Even the air you breathe is not truly yours. It is shared. It is borrowed from forests and plankton and countless small lives that change the atmosphere simply by existing. That is not metaphor, that is chemistry. And in that chemistry, there is continuity. So take a slow breath, if you can. Not to force relaxation, not to perform calmness, just to notice what breathing really is. A quiet exchange with an ancient system. Air in, air out. A rhythm that connects you to everything living and to everything that once lived. If the Earth's deepest record is written in layers, then your body is a moving layer 2 matter passing through a temporary form, holding awareness for a while, and then letting it go. There is something oddly comforting in realizing you don't have to win against time. You don't have to outlast a planet. You don't have to carve your name into stone to justify your existence. You only have to exist with care inside the moment you have, because care is one of the few things that can cross a boundary between eras, not as an artifact, as a condition. A civilization that chooses care changes what comes after it. It alters the world's readiness for the next beginning. It leaves behind not just a scar and sediment, but a softer transition, a gentler handoff, a world less damaged, more capable of beauty. That's a kind of immortality the Earth can actually carry. Not because it remembers your name, because it remembers your influence. In the end, the question, were there others, may remain unanswered forever. The planet may never give us a clear relic, a perfect artifact, a line of text, carved into some mineral stable enough to survive the churn. But perhaps the unanswered question is part of the gift, because it keeps us humble. It keeps our curiosity alive. It keeps us from imagining we are the final act. It keeps us looking at the world as something deep, ancient, and still unfolding. And if you listen closely, if you let the night be quiet enough, you can almost feel the planet's slow breathing beneath everything. Not in a mystical sense, in the practical sense that the Earth is always moving. Somewhere, rock is melting. Somewhere, new crust is forming. Somewhere, water is dissolving minerals and carrying them away. Somewhere, a forest is exhaling oxygen into an atmosphere shaped by billions of years of living. The story is ongoing, and you are inside it, for a brief and luminous moment. If sleep is near, you don't need to hold all of this in your mind. You don't need to solve it. You can let it drift. Let the images soften, the continents drifting, the oceans swallowing shelves, the thin, bright line of our era in future stone, the possibility of other minds rising and fading before us. Let it all become a quiet background hum, because your body already understands cycles, breath, heartbeat, waking, rest, the small, faithful resets that keep you alive. And in those small cycles, you're practicing the larger one, a gentle letting go, a return, a renewal. So if the world feels heavy sometimes, if the future feels uncertain, if the past feels too large to hold, remember this: you are not alone in time, not because you have proof of those who came before, but because you are made of what came before. You are the planet's memory moving forward. You are the universe briefly looking at itself through human eyes. And even when your eyes close, even when your thoughts fade into sleep, the larger rhythm continues, steady, patient, ancient. The Earth forgets. And in its forgetting, it makes room for remembering again. Good night. Rest as gently as you can. The story continues, with or without words, beneath the quiet layers of stone and water and time.